Oh my God. Our house is freaking destroyed, Josie. Oh my God. Where's Autumn?
Caught on camera, incredible new video of Friday's powerful EF3 tornado touching down and then sweeping over the town of Andover, Kansas. Wind speeds hit 165 miles an hour and left a path of destruction nearly 13 miles long. More than 1,000 buildings were destroyed.
For most people, that day began like any other. The streets were alive with routine movement, familiar sounds, and the false comfort of normalcy that makes danger feel impossible. Parents rushed children to school, coffee shops filled with the usual morning crowd. Everything felt safe because everything felt familiar. There was no siren cutting through the air. There was no final announcement telling people to run. There was no countdown. What happened next arrived without warning, without mercy, and without giving anyone time to understand what was unfolding around them. The morning had started with clear skies and mild temperatures. Weather forecasts promised nothing unusual. Local meteorologists spoke casually about partly cloudy conditions and a slight chance of afternoon showers. Nothing in their data suggested what was quietly assembling in the atmosphere above. Natural disasters often announce themselves slowly. Storms are tracked on radar for days. Hurricanes are named and monitored, their paths projected hourly. Volcanoes tremble before they erupt. Floods rise gradually, giving people time to evacuate. But this disaster did none of that. It formed quietly, invisibly, beneath conditions that most people did not recognize as dangerous. By the time the signs became obvious, escape was already slipping away. The invisible threat. Meteorologists would later explain that the atmosphere had been building tension for hours, layering instability upon instability in a way that is rare, unpredictable, and terrifying in hindsight. Warm air was rising rapidly while cold air collapsed downward, creating violent energy trapped in the sky. Wind shear was developing at multiple altitudes. Moisture levels were climbing. The atmosphere was becoming a pressure cooker. On paper, it looked like interesting weather, perhaps a strong thunderstorm. In reality, it was a loaded weapon waiting for a trigger. That trigger came suddenly, when everything changed. In one moment, the sky darkened in a way that felt unnatural, as if daylight itself had been swallowed. It was not gradual, it was instant. It was wrong. The wind did not slowly increase, it snapped into existence. 1 second the air was still, the next it was howling with fury. It tore through streets and open spaces with a force that did not feel like weather anymore. It felt alive. People who were outside described the sound first, a deep, continuous roar that drowned out everything else. It made it impossible to hear screams, alarms, or even one's own thoughts. The roar filled everything, vibrating through bodies and bones. Windows began to shatter inward, exploding into rooms and sprays of glass. Trees bent at impossible angles before snapping like matchsticks. Loose objects became weapons, flying at deadly speeds. Trash cans tumbled down streets. Metal signs tore free and sailed horizontally. Debris created a deadly cloud that made being outside a death sentence. Inside the chaos. Inside homes and buildings, confusion turned into panic within seconds. Power failed almost instantly, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. Phones lost signal. Radio stations went silent. People did not know what was happening, only that something had gone terribly wrong. Some tried to flee, grabbing car keys and rushing toward vehicles, but cars stalled as debris clogged roads within minutes. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Street signs disappeared, landmarks vanished. Every second mattered, and every second was being stolen by chaos. Others were trapped where they stood. In one neighborhood, a family of 5 gathered in a hallway, pressing themselves against interior walls as their building groaned and shook. The The sound above them grew louder, then deeper, as if the earth itself was tearing open. They would later say the most terrifying part was not knowing whether the structure would still exist when the noise stopped. In another area, emergency responders tried desperately to reach people calling for help, but roads were blocked, communication systems were failing. The disaster was moving faster than any response could follow. All their training meant nothing when visibility dropped to zero and conditions changed every few seconds. The randomness of destruction. What made this event especially devastating was how localized and sudden it was. One street could be completely destroyed, while another, just a few hundred meters away, remained almost untouched. This randomness created a false sense of safety for some and instant tragedy for others. Families separated by just a few blocks experienced entirely different events. Some saw minor damage, others saw devastation so complete that their homes simply ceased to exist. The lottery of location determined who lost everything and who lost nothing, and there was no logic anyone could understand. The terrible silence. When the core of the disaster finally passed, it left behind a silence that felt wrong. Not peaceful, not calm, just empty. Broken only by distant sirens, the crackle of damaged power lines, and the sound of people calling out names into spaces that no longer looked familiar. People emerged slowly from wherever they had sheltered, stepping out into a world that had been fundamentally altered in minutes. Entire sections were unrecognizable. Buildings had shifted off their foundations. Vehicles were piled in unnatural positions. Trees lay scattered like debris. The ground itself looked scraped and rearranged by forces beyond human control. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere. Family photographs fluttered in the breeze blocks from the homes they had decorated. Furniture sat in streets. Clothing hung in power lines. The randomness was disorienting and deeply disturbing. Understanding what happened. As daylight returned, the scale began to sink in. Authorities struggled to assess damage because landmarks used for navigation were gone. Aerial footage revealed patterns of destruction that looked almost surgical, carving narrow paths of devastation through populated areas. This was not widespread flooding or slow destruction. This was precision chaos. Survivors told stories that didn't sound real when spoken aloud. People described being lifted off the ground. Others remembered clinging to objects with strength they didn't know they had. Many spoke about the moment they realized they might not survive, and the strange calm that followed that realization. Scientists would later analyze the event, trying to understand how something so violent could form so quickly. Their conclusions were unsettling. Under the right conditions, disasters like this don't need long warnings. They don't need days of buildup. They only need the right balance of invisible forces aligning at the wrong moment. That realization changed how experts thought about forecasting and preparedness. It exposed gaps in warning systems. It showed that some disasters will always move faster than our ability to react. Those answers remained uncertain, but what was certain was that those who survived would never forget. They would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. They would remember how close they came to losing everything in a disaster that arrived without warning, without mercy, and without giving them time to understand what was happening until it was nearly too late. And they would remember the silence that followed, that terrible, empty silence, broken only by sirens, by sparks, by voices calling out names, hoping for answers that might never come.